This is the StoryWorks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Hello and welcome to this week's StoryWorks Roundtable. This week, Alida and Robert continue their conversation with Molly McCloy, talking about the intersection between Molly's oral storytelling and her written memoir. We'll pick up right where they left off, talking all about the arc of Molly's story and Molly's journey.
You mentioned the arc of the memoir with, the children growing apart from the father and then revolting against the father. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the arc of the family versus the arc of yourself as the character in this memoir?
Honestly, I think I need to work out my arc better. And that's what, as I'm editing, that's what I'm really sort of shooting for. And I think kind of the simple concrete arc that I think the storytelling is going to provide that arc. I think there's going to be a storytelling element of it. It's going from, not being able to talk about these things at all to talking about these things on a stage. So the show's going to be like actually in the book a little bit. So
yeah.
And going from being really socially stunted and awkward and sort of ostracized and to kind of finding writing and finding a way to do that. I think that's going to be my arc, although I'm not sure. And then, there's got to be some culpability in there somewhere. It's a little bit hard to get to for me, what am I forgiving myself for? What am I responsible for? And so a little bit of it's guilt about having to leave and having to have sort of separation. I'm always the one that's sort of left. Where the arc of the family is, by the time I left senior year in high school, it was just such a mess. Like everything was so codependent and there was just a ton of finger pointing going on. Like, my brothers were trying to insist that they weren't on drugs, and then they were pointing at my dad, well, you drink, and then I was just like, oh God, I just want to get away from all of you, which is what I did. So, there was a certain golden period where my brothers got sober and things came back together where I thought everything was going to be okay. It was right around the same time that I got the apologies. And I don't know what happened to that, but I've kind of developed a point of view about just appreciating those isolated moments and not expecting them to be sustained,
Right, like a false happy ending. Yeah.
Well, there's that kid part. Well, maybe this is my arc. There was always that kid part in me that just, when my dad was nice, when my dad was good, I was like, okay, finally, he's going to be like this from here on out.
Forever,
Everything's going to be perfect. Everything's going to be easy, always that idealistic part of me,
Yeah, the story about the balloon at Disneyland really hones in on that. That was very poignant, the ending of that. And
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the ending for the show. Oh wow, you watched the show.
I did. I went through all the stuff you sent me, Molly. I know. It was worth it. It was well worth it. Excellent stuff. Yeah. Wow. Can you talk about developing yourself as a character? You're writing personal essays, a memoir. So it's all you in your life, but then you can't just be you. You can't just put your life on paper. Can you talk about crafting yourself into a character?
Oh, wow. Philip Lopate's got some good stuff on that. Am I drawing on it, though? Should I go back to that? He's got the, the two pitfalls. The one where I'm so normal and boring that nobody's going to care about me.
I just assigned Lopate's essay to one of my students.
Right? And then the other one is I'm so weird that nobody's going to relate, right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, come to think about it, that's kind of similar to the two responses of when you're talking about trauma, right?
Right.
It keeps falling into those two sort of, so I guess trying to sort of, what I'm trying to get to that I really like about David Sedaris is I'm trying to get to his sense of shamelessness. I really like, because there is so much shame about being from a violent home and stuff. But I've got another piece that you guys haven't read, but that gets into why I liked drugs in high school, and I kind of borrowed that from Sedaris a little bit, where he was like, he was so happy about finding drugs and cigarettes because they stopped him from doing his tics from being OCD, right? And so to just have that shameless of like, I like drugs, it kind of, so I'm trying to see if I can kind of adopt sort of a shameless, honest attitude when I can, because my pitfalls, sometimes I get a little bit too self-pitying, too like victim-y, like, oh, this thing happened to me, or I gloss over it with humor and I don't get into there are some hard things since you saw the show, there's at least one instance of physical abuse, and I'm trying not to just make that my qualifying characteristic. Like I can write about abuse because I have physical abuse in the book, and what I'm trying to do is get into how that affected me and how that felt. So without falling to self-pity or just glossing over it with humor. Right. So I'm trying, and it's a hard thing to do because it's hard for me to process these things that have happened to me.
Right.
But the number one thing that I've done is helped me to kind of take control of the stories and to be able to have some perspective and objectivity on the stories is doing the show, is getting up and actually telling the stories and working on the stories over and over and over again. And finally, being able to feel them, because, it's pretty hard it was pretty hard for me to feel some of those things in the moment. I had to disassociate from it and, come away from it. So, I can't say I'm all the way there yet, but I think my goal is to be able to sort of relay these things that have happened in a way that's more universal, and to be able to find an active protagonist in some of it, I think has been really important. And that was the key to being able to do that, to relay that moment of physical abuse in the show, was that I really went back into what happened. And I remembered that my older brother was sort of a hero in the moment, and I hadn't ever thought of that story that way before, but I was like, okay, this is good because it gives it, we're not just being victimized. There's a story of somebody sort of standing up and doing something here. So it's not just going to be passive in pain. And the same thing with the Easter story. I never would have found it unless I did the show, but I was like, I always feel so weird about that. Is it abuse that my dad threw away our Easter candy? It was sure hard for me, and I was sure mad about it and upset about it for a long time, and it really did feel traumatic to me, and I was crying when I was trying to rehearse the moment. And then my director, Kristen Clifford, who's great, she went to school with me and she's done all kinds of theater stuff, and she directed my show. She said, oh, this line is funny. And it was, we were going to kill my dad.
Yes.
So basically this idea that we were going to kill him later over, destroying all of our Easter candy, that, we had this fantasy of when he got old enough, we were going to push him in his wheelchair off of a hill, and so that became more active. It was like, okay, there's the coping strategy. If I can take the coping strategy out of the victimization and the trauma, then I can write about it. Then I can deal with it,
Right. And that wheelchair revenge became a touch point that you circled back to multiple times during the narrative. And it also, as you were talking, I realized that gives the character some agency. We've got a young child who's being emotionally abused by this trauma, and what can you do? I mean, you're physically helpless. You have no power in that situation, but through your imagination and through the idea of enacting revenge 50 years later by pushing the old man's wheelchair down the hill, you not only add that humor, but you add agency, and then you create this nice kind of touch point that is both dark and, adds levity to a moment. I think that's an excellent craft piece.
Yeah, I think finding that agency, and I don't think I would have found that unless I went through the process of having to like stand up and tell the story, because I was saying that line as a dramatic line,
right,
for a bit, right? Like, oh, isn't this terrible? Because I again, that self-pity mode that I got into. Oh, is my dad terrible? He threw away all of our Easter candy. We were gonna kill him,
Yeah.
It's the wrong tone, Yeah.
Right.
It's actually pretty funny.
Yeah. So how do you know whether something is funny or not when you're doing a written narrative? Orally in doing your one-woman show, you had a director who said to you, hey, that's actually a funny line, and then you knew to shift the tone. But in writing, we lose your pauses, your inflection, right? So it's all just down to the words on the page, and you aren't present with the reader. So how do you craft for tone in these pieces?
Yeah. Well, you could get some rhythm out of paragraphing, right?
Yeah.
And separating out, doing some of those one paragraph or one sentence paragraphs that people are kind of divided about. But, so yeah, you get
right.
some rhythm that way, right?
Yeah.
I've been working with an editor, and she's sort of interested in me making my lists into true lists instead of jammed together lists, like working them out, making them kind of, so there are certain things you can do to create rhythm on the page, right?
Yeah.
And I have to have other people read my stuff. That's just becoming more and more clear to me, is that working with an editor is really helping me, having somebody to push my work,
Right. Right.
And then that person can find and I can find out, well, is this funny or not? And then reading it out loud, to myself helps a little bit too.
Right. Definitely. You, hang on a second here. So you open this essay, Fragile Donkey. I just want to read one of your paragraphs, because it's so much of what we've just been discussing is in this paragraph. And you open with your brothers tiptoeing down the room at 2 a.m. They come into your bedroom. You've gone to bed with all your clothing on, so we're opening in action. We step over my record player and brush past my Winnie the Pooh stuffed into my doll cradle. And there's this sense of youth, innocence, childhood, just kids being kids in this opening. And you're afraid of waking up mom and dad, as any child sneaking around the house would be. And then you have some of those one sentence paragraphs. My heart beats wildly. No bedroom door cracks open. No parental voice rings out. And here the paragraph I wanted to read where you give to the reader so much of what we've just been talking about how do you introduce the topic of abuse without it being too heavy, without you being passive. Tom puts his finger to his lips again and nods at us. He reaches for the deadbolt. If you did not grow up with a violent parent, you might not grasp how thrilling this moment is. The commonly used language, abused children, always paints us as weak and passive. Yet, here we are, well armed and ready for adventure. I've got the mini baseball bat, and Jake has the switchblade. Our leader, Tom, is the worldly one at age 10, and he's got a pair of nunchucks he made himself. I guess you could call us bad kids, but that's not quite right either. How about hooligans? I like it. We are hooligans. Oh, that is a knockout paragraph. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You just...
Yeah, I love it.
Well, thank you. No, you pack it full of so many surprises. We open with just, oh, we're kids. We're sneaking out of our bedrooms. Hee hee hee. We're so young. We have Winnie the Pooh. And then, if you didn't grow up with a violent parent, you might not grasp how thrilling this moment is. It was already thrilling for any kid. And now, stakes just shot.
The stakes just went up
so high, right? And you tell us right out as the narrator, people say abuse children. That makes you think we're weak and passive, as we were just talking about. And yet here we are, well armed and ready for adventure. So you might think a flashlight. You might think a security blanket. You might think, no, a baseball bat, a switchblade, and nunchucks. It's like jaw-dropping what these children are up to. And guess what? The oldest one is only 10, right? And you bring us back around. But, look, we're not bad kids. We're hooligans. That's a fun word. So well done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was... that paragraph came kind of late in the game. That was after working with my editor. Mm-hmm. She was asking me, she was like, why is this moment where your brother is opening the door, why is that so long, in the story? And I thought about it, and I was like, well, I want to keep it long, know. And then, because I still remember it really vividly, even though I was young, it was exciting and I could still feel myself there. And it was because we had to be so careful because that could have been horrible. So it was just my brother teaching us, like, here, and we got really good at being sneaky, and that's what was going on there. And so just that simple editing comment of like, okay, why are you taking so much time with him unlocking this door? And I thought, I need to explain this, and then that context came in, and I'm so glad that became a good paragraph, and I really love the way you read that.
Yeah, and yes, very nice. And also, I think, you use some horror conventions in there as well. So the paragraph in itself is just a little vignette of a horror story where time gets slowed down as you're trying to tiptoe past a monster, and the monster could attack at any moment. And we know how bad the monster's going to be because, we've heard this before. But also what I like is that you flip the victimhood and the self-pity really nicely. So, you've said that you're concerned about that. I think I like the way you've treated it there, because you've named it and said it is possible to have this, and you haven't said we didn't have it. You've just said it did this to us. And so I think that's a really nice way of, rather than saying, kids who suffer at the hand of a violent parent tend to become violent. You haven't said that. You haven't told it. You've shown it. And, the whole show don't tell thing. But there's a classic example of, we didn't, we had a tendency to become violent because that's what we needed to do. We armed ourselves with violent things because that's what we thought we needed to do. And it's kind of that famous 5 type adventure thing in there as well, only more dangerous. So all in one paragraph. Well done.
Thank you.
Yes. So I don't know where this is going to go in the actual memoir, but as a standalone piece in a literary journal, you need to introduce us to the idea of these stakes, that if mom and dad wake up, it's not just getting sent back to bed or maybe being grounded tomorrow. It's serious. So how many ways and means have you had to find to bring these elements into your essays as you put them out into the world or tell the stories on stages? And does it become tedious for you as the one crafting it? It's never tedious for the audience who's, hearing it fresh, but how are you approaching that aspect of it?
I'm kind of having to reuse that list, like my great grandfather stabbing people with a fork, my grandfather killing a dog with a hammer, and then my dad, dragging and kicking me, I think Lope would just say, well, you have to do that, and I just feel, I want to write about this in this essay that I want to do on trauma and humor. But I just feel like there are certain things that you have to do in order to make somebody willing to listen to a story about trauma.
Right.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, I've got to do this, and it's, maybe I should come up with different ways of doing it. But so far, I've just been like, oh, okay, let me put in the family history, So I'm a little bit sort of numb to it at this point. I'm like, all right, let's put family history here, you know.
Lydia Yuknevich said in an interview about the chronology of water that while she was working on the book, she had taken a scene of her abuse to her writing group. And their feedback, you know, as writers, not as friends, but as writers looking at a manuscript, was that the scene describing the abuse felt cliche to them. If memory serves, cliche is the word she used to quote her writers group, you know, and it was horrible. And she had to go into the bathroom and cry as a result of that. But she also then took that feedback and revised her manuscript and took out scenes like that where she describes the abuse and found other ways to reference it. Are you finding, what is your strategy for, you know, other than humor, how much do you put on the page? How far do you, I don't know.
I'm kind of terrified of that part of my book. I sort of avoid it a little bit, you know, and I think, okay, now this time I'm going to be ready to handle this part of my book, you know, and it's the part that I avoid the most, you know. And it's possible that it is cliche at this point, you know.
I don't like the word cliche. I don't feel like anyone's personal experience is cliche, but you know, I kind of get why that word came up in her
she
feedback.
Was getting one of those two responses to trauma. She was kind of getting the sort of it's not good enough almost thing or something. It's interesting. I think it's super tricky, especially because, well, you know, you might get a really negative response from somebody that's experienced similar trauma or worse trauma, which I think is part of where some of my responses come from, responses that I've gotten. But then you get people that are completely unfamiliar with this they just did not grow up in a home like that, right? So, and do they have any interest in reading about it at all? You know, is there some way to bring them into it, you know?
Right.
I don't know. I guess I would say that I'm kind of actively avoiding that part of my book right now.
Which raises the question whether it even needs to be in there or not when you have so many essays and moth stories and a completed manuscript that are doing, you know, that are working, that are out there, that are engaging audiences. So maybe, you know, the story is about the family and the story is about those arcs and the coping mechanisms and such.
I think it has to be. I think we have to keep coming back to the forgiveness and the grudges, or it's too hard for people, you know. I mean, it's too hard for me that way, you know.
Right.
So, because the thing that saves that scene in the show is the fact that my really unconventional brother, you know, like, you know, we're having, I'm not going to spoil it for people, but we're having sort of this physical standoff with my dad. And I was always into sports and athletics, and I had this wimpy older brother, right? You know, and so my response is, I'm going to hold up physically to this. And his response to it was, I'm not going to do this at all at a certain point, which blew my mind even as a kid. I was like, oh, here I've had my brother pegged as weak, you know, because he's so sort of unconventional and not traditionally masculine, but yet that's kind of what he drew upon, and what saved him in that moment is that unwillingness to literally play a game, right? Like a physical kind of game, you know? So, I think that's what saves that moment. But then yet, I think skipping to that, like, I do have a draft. I think it's important to get to how I felt while that was happening, and I do think that's in there. And so, you know, I don't know. It's about half of the page, maybe, you know.
Wow.
I don't think I've given you a very good answer on this one. I'm sorry.
No, I think you did. I think you gave a great answer. No, I was just thinking, let's move away from abuse and back to, crafting these personal stories. Do you have any advice or thoughts about how you move, like how the oral storytelling helps you shape your written narrative, or vice versa, or, just kind of tie us back together here?
Okay, so we talked in the last show a little bit about that openness of being able to keep working with stuff and keep changing it, keep reapplying it and sort of recycling it and using it for other things. So Fragile Donkey, for example. So there are a bunch of stories in that one story, right? And initially what I was trying to do with some of those stories, so there is the donkey at the garden store story, right? So initially that was the whole story, and that's the story that I told, right? Like I wrote that like, I don't know, 2001, 2002, something like that, But then I kept wanting all the time to sort of describe this sneaking out experience with my brothers, but there was no story. I was like, what's the story of that? And I was like, okay, well, what if this was about making Jake feel better about that donkey story? So so we can open with that. And then I've tried over and over. I have a lot of scam stories. For some reason, I like schemes and scams, and I have like my whole life. And sort of pulling things off, from getting like a fake ID, and it was this whole thing. But so I had been telling these childhood scam stories for a while too, and I was like, oh, well, what if those were also a way of like making back this money that needed to be made back? So what I finally figured out how to do with that story that I was really happy about, I was like, oh, now I know how to take these stories that I've been trying to do as full-length stories and they haven't worked. I haven't found the theme in them. They haven't been satisfying on their own. Okay, so I'm going to put this story in the service of this story, connect this story, and kind of brick them all together and kind of arrange them all together. And so I think that I wouldn't have had the idea to do that if I hadn't been doing so much recycling of stories and using stories for various themes and using them over and over again. So I think, and I think that's probably how I'm going to get from 130,000 words on my manuscript down to 90,000, is doing some of that, is figuring out which stories can be compressed in service of another story, use that technique, But I think I have, I think I have oral storytelling to thank for that openness about using stories in different ways and compressing them.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that Robert was saying in the last episode that you nest stories together, and that is a part of that. That's cool. I want to end by reading your final paragraph, and then if you want to comment on it or discuss it, please do. It brings us full circle to your opening where you talk about being hooligans, that paragraph I read before. So Jake, the younger brother, you say chicken, egg, chicken. It's anyone's guess. Still, it's strange that our youngest pioneered the numbness strategy. He leapfrogged Tom and me while we were still dabbling in idealism. Jake didn't seem old enough for this response to our father's violence and withholding. The look he shot everyone in the truck didn't fit his second-grader body and twiggy arms. With his home-cut blonde bangs and his freckled nose, my brother looked like an off-kilter Opie against the vinyl of the bench seat. A hooligan hard enough to target our mom. That sentence, that is one of those that just sticks with you, my goodness. Yeah, and it, there's so much focus on the dad as the villain, shall we say, of the story, and then to think of anything being projected toward or put on your mom, just that last that very last phrase, hard enough to target our mom. It's like in the previous episode, I said you keep shifting our meaning, right? You give us something and we're like, okay, it means this. And then the narrative evolves and, oh, now we're looking at it this other way. So, and the word hooligan, circling back to that word hooligan, is just so perfectly done. So there you go. That's my love of that ending. But
I'm gonna have to give
comment on crafting that.
If you want to know about the editing.
Sure.
So credit to I'm not sure how to pronounce her name because it's just all been in writing, but Michelle Gurul, who did the editing and chose the piece for Black Mesa Review. Did some editing on the end of it where she shortened things down. I initially worked with Piper Daniels, who's my editor, who's awesome, and who helped me get to the hard ideas that I was having trouble getting to. So those were already there, but it was kind of long. And she wanted to shorten it down, and it was Michelle's idea to get the word hooligan back in there, which I think was a really good idea.
Definitely.
But I didn't quite like the way she was doing it yet. And then, so it was kind of like it had already been edited by one editor, and then it had been edited by her. And then it was one of those endings, like I was talking about in the last episode, where it was just the very last minute. I was like, okay, well, let's just talk about this ending because I want to figure this out. And right before I called her, I just jotted that down and wrote it down. I was like, okay, it's right to use the word hooligan. She's right about that. We got to do that callback. But I want to say this. But then my other editor, had said, this is really interesting. The fact that, your brother's targeting your mom. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take both of those things and just get them right to one spot, Yeah.
Perfect.
And it leaves you with intrigue as well, because you think,
Wow. Well, any final thoughts, anything you want to bring up, Robert, or anything you want to add to take us out of this conversation, Molly?
No, I think that's about it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Molly. This has been a fantastic conversation. We are going to link to your Fragile Donkey essay in Blue Mesa Review, as well as your Story Slam YouTube videos and your website, mollymccloy.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.